The AP US History curriculum loves the Cold War. As the only war where no real shots were fired, it's no surprise that many APUS students find the Cold War equally confusing. But this period of time between 1945 and 1991 almost always finds its way onto an FRQ or a DBQ in the free response section of the AP exam. The trick to answering a free response question on the Cold War is not necessarily memorizing little facts, although those can be useful, but rather remembering the big themes. In this video, we'll be going over the Cold War presidencies in a broad sense. More importantly, we'll learn how to look for change over time in the Cold War and how different US presidents responded to the Soviet Union in dramatically different ways. Each of the separate points we cover could be really good data points to use in an AP level essay. World War II ended with the bombing of Japan, and right after that happened, the Cold War was inaugurated, according to historians. Enter Harry Truman, the first of our Cold War line of leaders. Truman probably faced challenges like no other. He was to oversee the building of a war-torn world and check the expansion of communism at the same time, a philosophy known as containment. More than any average presidential challenge, in my opinion. He did this primarily by providing economic aid abroad with the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, while building up arms capacity at home, starting with establishing the Department of Defense in 1947. Truman also was the first one to prove that we were no pushover. When the Soviets tried to block the Allied powers out of Berlin, he ordered a massive airlift that supplied the city in 1948. He left Eisenhower, our next president, with a personality kind of like a firm grandpa, an important legacy to build on. Eisenhower resolved the Korean War with a stalemate. The rest of aid he provided to the rest of the world was not as directly economics as was Truman's, but was rather focused on idealistic military aid. But it's important to realize that for Eisenhower, that for long-term foreign relations, he didn't really have much actual military action against the Soviets. For example, we did not interfere in the Hungarian uprising of 1956, although in 1957 Eisenhower did follow up with his doctrine by promising Middle Eastern nations US aid in the future. His most significant Cold War contribution, I would say, would be the idea of the military-industrial complex which he left us with in 1961, building up the national defense industry. Now for time's sake, I know we're moving pretty fast through all these presidents, but let's make sure we understand conceptually what each president's agenda was, rather than just memorizing examples. Our next president, Kennedy, faced the closest the world would ever be to a nuclear war, but he held his ground, even if it meant compromising a little bit on a hardline stance. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, JFK's unrelenting position finally motivated the Soviets to back down and remove nuclear warheads from Cuba. But there's a catch. He also agreed to remove American missiles from Turkey. So while JFK might not have crushed the Soviets in a dramatic movie way, he definitely understood the implications of the nuclear crisis and brought an uneasy cooperation between the two powers. After his assassination, though, Lyndon Johnson, or LBJ, was saddled for much of his term. In response to growing communist expansion in Southeast Asia, he increased the presence of American troops in Vietnam, leading to our most controversial war. It's a good point to right here, look back from the economic containment techniques of Truman, and just 2 decades later, our presidents became involved in indirect military invention. This is a great point to analyze change over time, the basis of a DBQ, and definitely a plus for any AP FRQ. After Nixon was elected, he campaigned to end Vietnam, a policy called Vietnamization, in response to the widespread protests in the country. Nixon's presidency did see quite a bit of détente, or relaxation of tensions, with the Soviet Union. Importantly, both nations signed SALT I, a nuclear arms limitation treaty. But at the same time, Nixon did authorize airstrikes against Cambodia for fear of communist presence. So I guess on the whole we could say he did lay the groundwork for détente, while having a pretty confused and sometimes secretive military situation. Our next two presidents, Ford and Carter, basically sought to continue détente. Carter in particular focused on something which he termed humanitarian diplomacy, reopening relationships in China in 1979, and attempting, although not succeeding, to pass the SALT II arrangements to limit lethal weapons. Unfortunately, while Carter did succeed in relaxing tensions, a crisis known as the Iranian hostage crisis limited his success toward the end of the term and catapulted onto the world stage our final Cold War president, Ronald Reagan. I once watched a video where a former KGB spy said the Russians' top fear was Reagan during this era, and for good reason. Reagan was a die-hard and hardline anti-communist. He not only secured the release of the Iranian hostages, but also authorized something he called the Strategic Defense Initiative, dubbed Star Wars, to massively heat up the arms race. Some historians even argue that the arms race drove the USSR into bankruptcy. However, with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, Reagan presided over the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Overall, his policies somewhat shifted between his two terms in office, due to the fact that in his second, the USSR was already on the brink of ruin. And there you have it, a mouthful of the major themes of each Cold War president. So let's leave you with a little summary phrase for each president to put all this into perspective, especially for an essay where you'd need to analyze themes above everything else. I personally think having a little bite-sized rundown is super helpful for timelines and free response questions. So here's a wave representation for you math whizzes out there on how the Cold War went, at least from the interaction of American presidents. Truman began with containment, and this was mostly economic aid. Eisenhower, the tension was somewhat greater due to Korea, but he kept up with his ideas of idealistic aid and the promise of future military help. Tensions escalated further with JFK, although he did succeed in eliminating direct Soviet threats to the US mainland after the Cuban Missile Crisis. As you can see, tensions really spiked with communist countries around LBJ, with the escalation in Vietnam. With Nixon, it's a little bit rocky over here, as you can tell. There was détente, but also Cambodian airstrikes, so a little bit of a confused but decelerating situation. Ford and Carter saw détente Part 2 and humanitarian diplomacy. And finally, Reagan heightened the pressure on the Soviets, really pushed them hard, and then got to sit back and watch the collapse of the Cold War. So overall, I really hope that this somewhat rushed but big picture view of Cold War policy and presidents helps you nail your next AP essay. Thank you for watching, and good luck.